The day the municipal tax sale transfer was finalized, I was standing in a hallway outside the county clerk's office, holding a manila envelope and thinking about clay. Not the political kind, the real kind, the slip of it under my fingernails, the way it smelled after rain. The specific weight of a centered piece on the wheel at 6 in the morning when the studio was quiet and the kiln was just beginning to warm. I hadn't felt that particular weight in almost 2 years, not since the day a municipal bylaw officer taped a suspension notice to the front door of Renée's kiln and told me I had 72 hours to cease operations. My name is Josephine Renaud, Joe, and this is the story of how I lost the thing my mother built. And how the patience she spent a lifetime teaching me turned out to be worth considerably more than the legal fees I couldn't afford. My mother, Renée, moved from Montreal to a small town on the north shore of Lake Ontario in her late 30s with $4,000 in savings, a pottery wheel she'd bought from a studio closing in the plateau, and an absolute certainty that she was going to make something with her hands. She spent 11 years teaching ceramics out of a converted carriage house on the edge of town, slowly turning it from a drafty space with one second-hand kiln into a proper studio with 4 wheels, 2 kilns, a small showroom, and a waiting list for her Saturday beginner class that ran 3 months long. She called it Renée's Kiln, put her own handwriting on the sign above the door, and never once stopped to wonder whether it was a practical business or not. When she passed, pancreatic cancer, fast and unfair, the way it always is, I inherited the wheel, the building, and a mortgage she had been quietly chipping away at for a decade. I also inherited her complete inability to give up on something she believed in. I didn't know how much I would need that particular quality until the year my neighbor moved in. He arrived on a Saturday in early September, 3 years after my mother passed, and 2 years after I had taken over the studio full-time. He pulled into the property next door in a silver pickup with Alberta plates, a man in his mid-60s with the bearing of someone who had spent a career deciding how things should run. He introduced himself as Hugh Pemberton, recently retired, relocating from Calgary. He said he'd always wanted to live somewhere slower, somewhere quieter. I brought over a loaf of cranberry walnut bread the following morning, the way my mother always said you should greet a new neighbor. He thanked me, shook my hand, looked at the carriage house, and said the studio looked charming. 11 days later, the first complaint arrived. It was a noise complaint about the ventilation fan on Kiln 2, filed at 7:15 in the morning with the municipal bylaw office. It cited a specific section of the township noise bylaw and included a hand-drawn diagram of the property line. A bylaw officer came out, measured the ambient sound levels, found them within the acceptable range, and closed the file. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the beginning of the end. It was, as I eventually understood, just the beginning. Over the following months, my neighbor filed complaints about delivery vehicles blocking the shared laneway. The same window I had been using for deliveries since the year I took over the business. He filed a complaint about the parking habits of my Tuesday evening wheel-throwing class. He submitted a concern about what he described as a particulate nuisance from clay mixing drifting onto his property, a claim the investigating officer could find no evidence of whatsoever. He contacted the provincial fire marshal's office with questions about kiln placement. He wrote to the local councillor about outdoor signage. He attended a municipal committee meeting to raise concerns about commercial operations in what he called a residential area, despite the carriage house property having been properly zoned commercial since 1997, a fact I confirmed in writing at my own expense. I went to his door after the 4th complaint. I wasn't angry, not yet. I wanted to understand whether there was something genuine underneath it, some actual concern I could address. He stood on his porch with his arms crossed and told me he had nothing against me personally, that he simply believed in following the rules, and that he thought everyone in the neighborhood deserved clearer expectations around commercial activity. I went home and baked bread and tried to think about what my mother would have done. She would have kept going, so I did. Over 16 months, my neighbor filed 19 separate complaints against Renée's Kiln. Zoning inquiries, safety concerns, a claim that our parking arrangement violated an easement on the shared laneway, which it did not, as confirmed by a surveyor I paid $900 to establish on record. But the 19th complaint was the one that found its mark. He submitted a formal request for a permit audit to the municipality, citing concerns that the studio was operating commercial kilns without current certification under provincial technical standards regulations. what he had found, and I have never been able to determine exactly how, was that my mother had submitted a permit renewal application for a ventilation modification on Kiln 2 more than 2 years earlier. The application had been received, logged, and then lost in an administrative backlog at the municipal office. Never reviewed, never processed. Through no negligence on her part and no negligence on mine, we were technically operating with an outstanding application. The municipality, facing a formal written complaint from a retired man with apparently unlimited availability to attend every single hearing, suspended the studio's operating permit pending a full review. The review would take 8 to 11 months. I want to be precise about what happened after that, because I think people imagine there was a dramatic moment, a confrontation, a call with a lawyer who found a way out, something cinematic. There wasn't. What happened was quiet and entirely administrative. I sat at my mother's work table with the suspension notice in front of me and ran the numbers 3 times, and then a 4th time because I needed to be certain the answer was what I thought it was. It was. I could not cover the mortgage, the utilities, and 8 salaries for 8 to 11 months with the doors closed. I could cover approximately 6 weeks. I let everyone go on a Friday afternoon. I stood in the studio my mother had built, in the room where she had centered her first proper piece on a wheel she'd borrowed before she could afford her own, and I said the words out loud to 8 people who had been showing up to work there for years. 2 of them had been with me since the week I took over. 1 had been with my mother since her 3rd year of operation. The sound those words made in that room is something I don't fully know how to describe, except to say that the silence afterward had a kind of weight to it that I still feel when I think about that afternoon. I didn't go to my neighbor's door. I knew it would feel satisfying for about 4 minutes, and then just be me, standing on a stranger's porch, having accomplished nothing except giving him a reason to feel afraid of me, and a story to tell about how unreasonable I'd been. My mother used to say something I've thought about more times than I can count. Some battles end when you stop showing up to fight them. She didn't mean walk away. She meant choose your ground carefully, and then wait. I found work in October, 4 hours north in Barrie, buying artisan inventory for a home goods retailer that distributed across Canada. It was not creative work. It required me to evaluate other people's ceramics against spreadsheets and margins, which was, for the first several months, a particular kind of painful. But it paid reliably, and I was good at it, and I am my mother's daughter in the sense that I do not stop learning when circumstances are hard. In the evenings, I started recording. I had a decent camera, my mother's wheel, which I'd moved into the corner of the apartment I was renting, and a north-facing window that gave good diffused light in the mornings. I started with a series of short beginner videos, centering, pulling walls, trimming, and posted them under a new account I created called Renaud Studio. No mention of Renée's kiln, no geographic reference, no sign with my face on it, just hands-on clay, and whatever I could teach in 20 minutes. Within 3 months, the account had grown to 15,000 followers. Within 8 months, I had built a subscription teaching platform, a monthly membership fee, access to a library of pre-recorded courses, and 1 live workshop per month over video call. Overhead was a camera, a lighting kit, an internet connection, and a level of sleep deprivation I do not recommend to anyone. But the platform worked, and it kept working, and I understood why. I wasn't teaching ceramics. I was teaching the thing my mother had always been teaching, which was what it felt like to make something with your hands and have it be genuinely yours. By the following spring, Renaud Studio had just over 4,000 subscribers across Canada and a small but consistent wholesale line, handmade ceramic pieces sold to 3 boutique hotels in Toronto and a restaurant group in Ottawa. I incorporated properly, registered Renaud Studio Inc., and hired an accountant named Beatrice Okonkwo, who came recommended by the CFO of the home goods company as the most organized person she had encountered in 20 years of business. Bea was 53, had more energy than most people half her age, and expressed opinions about financial decisions with a directness I came to rely on completely. It was Bea who called on a Wednesday afternoon in November, almost exactly 2 years after I had driven out of my old town for the last time, and mentioned, almost as a footnote, at the end of a call about quarterly tax remittances, that a property in my former neighborhood had been registered for a municipal tax sale. I asked for the address. It was my neighbor's house. I didn't react right away. I told her I'd look into it and ended the call. Then I sat with a cup of tea that went cold while I thought. Then I called her back and asked her to pull the county records. 3 years of unpaid property taxes. A secured line of credit in default. A second mortgage taken out 14 months earlier. The timing, Bia noted in her characteristically level way, appeared to correspond with an investment in a failed commercial real estate development project in central Alberta. Whatever project my neighbor had moved on to after Renée's kiln closed its doors, it had not ended the way the complaint campaign had. I want to say honestly what I felt reading those records, because I've thought about it enough times that I know now it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't the clean vindication I had imagined during those first weeks when I was too exhausted and too angry to sleep properly. What I felt was something quieter. A recognition that certain situations run their course on their own schedule, provided you have the patience to let them, and the discipline to keep your own affairs in order while you wait. In Ontario, a municipal tax sale follows a defined process under provincial legislation. The municipality registers a tax arrears certificate. The property owner has a redemption period in which to pay the outstanding amount, and if that period expires without payment, the property proceeds to public tender. Any registered bidder can participate. The highest valid tender above the minimum price carries. I submitted a tender through Renaud Studio Inc. Bia's suggestion. No practical reason for my name to appear in any paperwork until after the transfer was complete, and no reason to draw attention before it was final. There were 2 other tenders submitted. I reviewed the minimum bid amount, considered what it meant to be certain, and tendered $2,600 above the next highest submission. The transfer confirmation arrived on a Thursday. I drove down on a Friday. I knocked on the door of the house next to the carriage house, where I had once spent every morning building something I loved. And my neighbor answered. He already knew. Small towns move information faster than any formal process. And he looked at me with the expression of someone who is still searching the paperwork, for the error there sure must be there. You did this, he said. The municipality conducted the tax sale, I told him. I submitted a tender. Those are both accurate. You think this is justice? His arms crossed, the same posture he'd had on his porch the first time I had come to speak with him, years ago, with bread in my hands. You think this makes us even? I don't think about even, I said. I came because you deserve to hear it from me directly, not from a registered letter. You have 60 days from the transfer date before I'll need access to the property. I'd use the time. I have a solicitor, he said. You should speak with them, I said. Tax sales in this province are difficult to set aside once the transfer is registered. But yes, get advice. His voice, when it came again, had changed. The certainty had drained out of it, and what was underneath was older and quieter and entirely recognizable. I've lived in this house for 3 years, he said. This is my home. I know what it feels like to stand somewhere and be told that what you built there is no longer yours, I said. You made certain that I understood that feeling very clearly. He didn't have a response to that. I didn't wait for one. I walked back across the laneway and stood for a moment outside the carriage house, looking up at the sign my mother had painted herself. Renée's kiln, faded now but still legible, and then I got in my car and drove back to Barrie, and I didn't cry until I was past the edge of town, and then I did, and it was fine. His solicitor sent a letter. The property lawyer I'd retained responded. The legal challenge, such as it was, dissolved within 3 weeks. The sale had followed proper procedure and there were no viable grounds for reversal. Several people I had known on that street reached out separately once word had spread. The retired teacher who had taken my mother's beginner class every autumn for 7 years sent a note that I read several times. I thanked each of them. There wasn't much more to say that the situation hadn't already said more clearly than I could have. I gave him 65 days rather than 60. Not because I felt any particular obligation to, but because my mother spent 20 years running a ceramics studio and never once made a student feel foolish for needing more time than expected. That instinct doesn't leave you just because someone has treated you badly. I think it's actually more important to maintain when it's hardest. The carriage house had been locked for 2 years. When I opened it in January, the equipment was in storage. The wheels were dusty, and the shelves where finished pieces used to dry were bare. I went through every room with a notepad, cataloged what needed repair and what needed replacing, and brought in a contractor for the structural work. There was a beam at the back of the studio that had needed proper attention for longer than I wanted to admit. Everything else I did myself across weekends, in the cold, with a space heater and my mother's old radio. The property next door gave me something I hadn't expected when I was calculating tender amounts: space. The backyard, south-facing, roughly a half-acre, with a large maple at the east end and good afternoon light through most of the year, backed directly onto the sidewall of the carriage house. I spent a week in February just standing in it at different hours, watching where the light landed, before I understood what I wanted to do. I built an outdoor teaching pavilion, cedar frame, open sides, a proper roof with reclaimed tin, electrical run from the main studio, a long central work table that could seat 14 people. Inside the carriage house, I added a sixth wheel, updated both kilns, and converted the front hallway into a proper showroom. Small, well-lit, with shelves I made myself from offcuts the contractor had left behind. I moved the Renaud Studio teaching platform under the Renée's Kiln brand. It was the right time to bring them together, and Bia agreed. The reopening was on a Saturday in May. My mother always said the light along the north shore of Lake Ontario in May was worth paying attention to. Something about the angle off the water in the early morning that doesn't happen any other time of year. She was right, as she tended to be about things she had taken the trouble to actually look at. I hired back 3 of the 8 people I'd had to let go. Dex, who had run the kiln schedule and who had spent the 2 years since working at a community pottery co-op out of a church basement 2 towns over, came back first. He cried when I called him. So did I. We didn't mention it again, and we have not mentioned it since, which is exactly the right way to handle it. The line on opening day ran down the side of the carriage house, across the laneway, and partway down the street. I still have the tender confirmation from the tax sale. It's in an envelope in the drawer of the old desk at the back of the studio. Not framed, not displayed, just folded and kept. I'm not entirely sure why, except that it reminds me of something I want to keep being true about myself. That I had the opportunity to be mean-spirited about all of it, and I chose not to, and I think that matters more than the amount on the tender form. The first thing I planted in the pavilion garden was a lilac. My mother had one against the back fence of our house in Montreal when I was growing up. She said it was the only flower that smelled exactly the way spring is supposed to, and I have never found a reason to argue with her about it. The second thing I did was take down the faded sign above the carriage house door and put up a new one. Same lettering, same careful handwriting. I had it reproduced from an old photograph, but freshly painted, clear enough to read from the far end of the laneway. Renée's Kiln, her name above the door she opened. Some people will devote considerable energy to dismantling what someone else has built. What they tend not to account for is that the same years that were hard for you were also passing for them. And patience, unlike most things, gets sharper the longer you've been carrying it.